right? We can ask, maybe one story is not influencing one another, but maybe rather they have a common source that is now lost. Maybe that's our other option. I'm more or less inclined to favor this view, and I'll explain that why in a little bit. But one of the things I would like to do to kind of explore this is going to actually look at the stories side by side, because things really pop when you do that. I'm going to use Ibn Ishaq's version because it's the version that resembles the Bede version the most. Just one selection of it. There's more resemblances beyond this little passage. But I'm just going to read them both, and we'll kind of see what we notice. So here we go. So it starts off, and the Prophet Muhammad is telling the story, by the way, in the first person. He says, he came to me, that is, Gabriel came to me while I was asleep, with a sheet of silk brocade with writing thereon, and said, read, iqra. I said, I cannot read, ma'aqra. But he pressed against me until I thought I would die. And then he released me and said, read. So I said, what shall I read? Mada aqra. Right? But I only said this to be delivered, lest he once again do to me what he did before. He said, read in the name of your Lord who did create humanity from coagulate. Read, for your Lord is magnanimous, who through the use of the calamus has taught humanity that of which it was oblivious, right? So this is the 96th surah of the Quran. And then the Prophet Muhammad picks up his self-narrative again. He says, I read it, and then he ceased and withdrew from me. I awoke from my sleep, and it was if he had inscribed a scripture upon my heart. Right? In any case, when we get to the Latin version, we see a lot of similarities, also some differences. For one, it's told in the third person. Right. In due time, Kedmon stretched himself out and went to sleep, whereupon he dreamt that someone stood by him, saluted him, and called him by name. Kedmon, he said, sing to me something. So here, instead of saying read, the command is sing. Right? Kedmon answered, I cannot sing. That is, I don't know how. Once again, the speaker said, nevertheless, you must sing to me. And then he answers again back, what shall I sing? Sing, he said, of the beginning of creation. It's interesting that we have creation in both versions too. At which answer he began to sing in praise of God, the creator, verses he had not heard before. And when he awoke, he remembered all that he had sung while asleep, and soon added more verses in the same manner, praising God in fitting style. The end we have, so there's a lot of interesting things that we have here, right? So it's not just, so we have differences, like I said before. One is a command to read, one is a command to sing. But also we have this shared structure that's very interesting. So we have one command, read, and then the response is, I cannot. Sing, I cannot. And we have the command again, read, and then instead of saying, I cannot, it's what? What shall I read? And in the Kedman version, of course, it's what shall I sing? And then we get number 3, read, and then it gives this the composition, the divine composition, and then the same thing happens in the Kedman story. Interestingly enough, the Prophet Muhammad, when he awakes, he just says it's as if the scripture had been inscribed upon my heart, or even in my mind, you could translate as. In other words, he had memorized it perfectly. And Kedman says the same thing. When he awoke, he remembered all that he had sung. So that's a lot of structural parallel for them to be sharing. And a lot of earlier folks that have looked at this material, they said, well, there's actually something they might share in common. It's a little bit obvious. And the answer to that is the Bible. So one of the most famous examples of this kind of correspondence that's been pointed out is Isaiah 46. It starts off, this of course written in Hebrew, but the Bible is well known at this point in the vernacular of many languages, including kind of Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Latin, of course, etc. It starts off, a voice rings out, proclaim, and then the word proclaim here is the same root as we have qara'a in Arabic. Another asks, what shall I proclaim? Or literally, what shall I read? You can even say. And then it gives what should be proclaimed. That's really the end of the parallel. And one of the things why I think it's a compelling example of what might be behind the narrative, I don't think it's a definitive answer. And one of the reasons why I think that is because appealing to Isaiah doesn't explain the shared structure. It's not just the kind of biblical language that is interesting here, but it's also kind of the shared structure. That's fascinating.
We have a couple of questions from Farhad Hudusi, basically going back to the story of the Iqra narrative, where we see parallels. I'm kind of summarizing the questions. You have the story of the Prophet Muhammad and Iqra, and then you have a similar narrative with Kedman, and then you have other parallels with the Romanos, the vision of Romanos, I think. So the question is about influence. Like, could the person, Farhad is wondering, could the Muslim narrative have influenced those other narratives? And I think, I know you touch on this in the book, and maybe,
Yeah. So I go into detail, a lot of detail in the book, like you said, trying to kind of discuss the scenarios under which that the Muslim narrative could possibly have influenced, like, say, Bede and things like that. And so that's something that I seriously consider. And I don't really give one view, either or, because I think it is a little bit of a toss-up. But one of the main conclusions that I think needs to be taken away from it, in general, is the answer to the following question: why is the story told the way that it's told? Right? Why does the story look like the way that it is? So the example that I often give to my undergrad students is a typical, like, romantic story that you get in like, say, modern cinema or whatever, right? Like a Harry Met Sally or something like that. Like all of these romance stories that we watch in movies, they all have the same thing, right? Two people that don't like each other, odd couple, they meet each other, but then they fall in love and they have this amazing relationship, but then they have an argument, they break up, and then it seems like they're never going to be together again. And then the last minute, the narrative brings them back together, the end, right? That's a very typical kind of rom-com story. Why are they all the same? It's not because they're all copying one another per se. It's because they're all playing into narrative expectations, right? Of what narratives that are about that topic are supposed to look like. I think part of what's going on is something like that. But yeah, I do think it's possible that the Muslim narrative influenced the other narratives. And we have many examples of Muslim narratives influencing Christian narratives and Jewish narratives and so on and so forth. But we also have many clear examples where Christian hagiography is kind of directly taken and assimilated to kind of the corpus of early Arabic literature as well. Both of those things are happening simultaneously.